I think discipline is one of like the sexiest traits an individual can have. It's such an awesome trait because people don't realize how much they can get done if they just employ discipline. And the truth is that like sometimes as humans we take time for granted, right? And the things that are important, um, when you really narrow it down, it's your family, it's your mental health, your physical health, all of these things that are like it's your career. All these things, if you really break it down, can be done in a day. It's just more about being intentional about how you do it. Hey, Mile 40 fam. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by the leaders in male grooming at Manscaped. They're helping us spice up the hair care regimen on our heads with something fresh. No, it's not a new razor. It's not ball deodorant. Get ready for the game-changing new Scalp Buffer by Manscaped. Let's break down why you need to add this bad boy to your hair care routine. First things first. Check out these thick silicone bristles. They're 100% antibacterial. No more germs hitching a ride on your head. The bristles gently exfoliate your scalp, and the product helps reduce flaking caused by dry skin and buildup. The bristles enhance shampoo penetration for more foam and less product use. It's not just about feeling good. A better lather means better cleaning power. You can also pair it with the 2-in-1 shampoo and conditioner from Manscaped for the ultimate hair care routine. These products are designed to work together, giving your hair the nourishment and strength it needs. Simply put, the Scalp Buffer is your scalp's secret weapon. Its antibacterial silicone bristles keep your scalp healthy, maximizes shampoo performance, gives you a soothing massage, kicks bacteria to the curb, and stores away like a champ. Take your scalp from zero to hero with the Scalp Buffer. Get 20% off plus free shipping with the code MILE40 at manscaped.com. That's 20% off plus free shipping with the code MILE40 at manscaped.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Mile 40 podcast. I am Bishoy Tadros, the author of Break Barriers and Audacious, both of which are sold on Amazon. And I invite you to join me as I engage with guests to discuss those bounce back moments that we encounter on our personal journey. Mile 40 is a forum to learn about how athletes, professionals, and leaders of all backgrounds stare down moments in life where the only option is to rise up. The Mile 40 podcast strives to remind listeners that the comeback is always greater than the setback. Welcome back to another episode of the Mile 40 podcast, episode 100. We made it. We are rocking and rolling. If you haven't already, please be sure to hit subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast from, check out the show notes, pick up a copy of Audacious Break Barriers, use code MILE40, and I will personally sign and deliver it myself. Today's episode is going to be a different kind of episode. I am putting myself in the hot seat by one of the most popular guests that I've had on the show. Episode 40 of Mile 40, featuring none other than my wife, Christine, is still one of the most downloaded episodes of the podcast. And so when I was thinking about ways to get clever for this episode, and truth be told, we actually tried to record this. Now, this is the third time. It finally dawned on us that maybe we should reverse roles. So Christine is going to be doing the interviewing today. I have had no preparation. I don't know what direction she's going to take this in, but I really hope that you enjoy this episode. And I just want to thank you for, again, sticking along for this journey. It's incredible that we made it this far. And hopefully I'll see you on the other side of this episode.
I'm guessing you didn't know where this would start or go. So here you are. What would you say you've learned the most throughout doing this podcast?
That's a good question. So I've learned that consistency matters. I already kind of had the sense that consistency matters, but especially when it comes to podcasting in particular, it was about a little over a year ago where I committed to one episode a week. And there was a direct correlation between me staying consistent with that one episode a week formula, and the listener base, and the growth of the show and the outreach of partners who wanted to work with the show. And so that was really cool to see. And that was definitely a lesson logistically. But if I take it a step further and look at it from an even bigger lens, you know, one of the things in a really positive way that I've learned from the show is that it really is true that everyone is walking around with their own story, their own set of circumstances, their own trauma, their own learnings, their own manifestations. And it's just really eye opening to take a step back, and understand that there's just so much of this world and there's just so much of humanity in general, that we don't know. I remember the first couple episodes I did of the show, and I remember the power in some of those stories. And I remember thinking to myself, well, like I don't really know what else I could unearth by speaking to other people. But then I'd get more and more guests on, and their stories would be just as powerful, in different ways. And that was really, really cool to see. So the thing about being a podcaster is at many points you think you can run out of content, or you think you can run out of stories to keep the listener engaged. But one of the things that I've learned over and over again is that every human has something unique to offer. And it's definitely something that has kept me going for the last several episodes.
And what would you say your goals are? Do you have any goals in particular for it?
It's similar to the book. Like, and I spoke about this in one of the last episodes when I talked about, it was actually the last episode when I talked about break barriers, right? Like when I wrote break barriers, I didn't have like a numerical goal. I didn't say, hey, like I want to sell this amount of books, or I wanted this, book to be, my way out of the corporate world. That wasn't really the way that I looked at it. And that taught me something. Um, if you focus on the more holistic outcome, which was with break barriers around getting the book in the hands of that one person who needed to, read the message in order to know that they're not alone, um, success will follow that, right? And so I learned that lesson with break barriers, and so I decided to re-employ that lesson, not just with Mile 40, but with Audacious as well. And so I never lead with, a numerical goal. I more so lead with, it would make me happy to know that there is someone out there who listened to a guest on the show who is going through something, extremely traumatic, and they were able to perk up and realize that they're not alone on this journey. And that was really the goal and the essence. Like when I think about Mile 40 and what it stands for, and why we even created this show, it's because after 3 years of talking about break barriers, I came to realize that Mile 40 embodied the message at its heart, and that message was that, regardless of who you are, regardless of your circumstances, you could be extremely privileged, and, you may have had, an upbringing that was, in some people's eyes, without blemish. That doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't had your own bottoming out moments, your own quote unquote Mile 40 moments. And so I was really intent on bringing on people, of all different backgrounds, um, to talk about their stories. And that's why also, like, I like to keep a wide spectrum of stories here, right? Like we've had people come on and talk about, they've talked about issues with addiction, issues with sexual abuse, issues with family trauma. And, I laugh because one of the more lighthearted episodes was Corporate Bro, bringing him on, and great guy. Really enjoyed speaking with him. And, he gave a much more lighthearted Mile 40 moment, talking about the time, a post of his went viral for all the wrong reasons and how the internet, hated him after that. And that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed. And when I think about goals, it's being relatable.
Mhm. That is good to know. Um, I know you have a lot going on, and you have ran 5 major marathons, and you're hoping to do Tokyo. Um, but after Tokyo, what would that's a big accomplishment and like a major overarching goal that you had. But what would be your fitness goals after that?
I've given that a lot of thought. I don't have the answer to that just yet, but the truth is that, this entire journey has culminated very naturally, right? Like when I ran my very first marathon back in 2017, there was a piece inside of me that thought I would never run a marathon again after that. And I actually thought I may have peaked at that point, right? Because a lot of people put running a marathon, quote unquote, as a bucket list item. And because my entire life, I didn't think I was necessarily qualified, fit, or amongst the people who would be running marathons, I really thought at that point that was it. And then once I committed to the sport and started to really exit my comfort zone and do things that earlier on in my running journey I was a little bit more resistant to do, I started to see the progress there, and not just progress in the results, but also progress with regards to how I started to develop this relationship with the sport of running. And so that was really, really cool to see. And it's a hard question to answer because I don't really know, because I never thought I'd be in a position to even go for my 6th world major. Now that it's becoming real, it's something that I think about. I think about, do I want to get into the world of ultra marathons? I really do want to do the New York City to Montauk run, that 130-mile trek. I do think, because the two destinations mean so much to me for different reasons. I think I could see myself taking on something like that. I also feel like in the back of my mind, there is a little bit of unfinished business when it comes to the world of triathlons and Ironmans. And so that's something that I definitely toy with. So I definitely will be visiting that. But I think right now, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to focus on the task ahead of me, and that is really just nailing down that 6 star.
Okay. Would you ever toy with any other sport or like swim or cycle?
Yeah, I mean that's what I was saying with regards to back to the world of triathlons and Ironmans, right? Like back when I did that first Ironman back in 2017, I was a horrible, horrible, horrible swimmer, like really bad swimmer. I had no confidence in my swimming ability. And mile 40 happened on the bike ride. And so both those areas were areas that I could definitely improve in and definitely build progress in. Um, I think I was intentional after running a couple marathons where I said to myself, I just want to get good at one of these sports. And it just turned out to be running. And so that's why over the last several years, running was the sport that I really devoted my time to. Um, and I think that perhaps after Tokyo, I'll be in a position then to kind of reopen the door. And also, like another thing I want to call out, my training regimen has changed so dramatically over the last 7 years. Like I didn't lift weights back in 2017. It wasn't something that I really was educated on knowing how to do. I was doing a lot of high intensity training, and I was, from the outside maybe looked like I was in good shape. But for a lot of the things that I wanted to do, I was forgetting some major pieces, such as strength, such as the power of nutrition, such as a focus on recovery. And I think that's one of the things that it's hard to, if you're just looking from the outside, you can't really notice those things. You think, oh, like that person is thin, they're toned, they're signing up for these events, they must be in good shape. And you asked me the other day, like there was a picture side by side of me running the same race 9 years apart, and you asked me, well, oh, like how much did you weigh back then? And the truth was, I actually weighed just about the same as I do now, but I looked completely different. And that's just because my focuses with regards to my regimen were completely different. And as a result now, the results on these courses are also, very different.
Mhm. Well, I think people don't know what we're referring to. You should probably show a picture of it.
Yeah, I could definitely point to it, and I'll post it on the page. But I this last week I just ran my sixth or seventh Hamptons half marathon. That was the very first half marathon I had ever run back in 2015. And I don't know what dawned on me. I think they just sent me the photos after the race, and I was like, oh, like I wonder what I looked like during my first race relative to this race. So I just put them side by side, and I kind of just chuckled because I was like, man, like I never would have thought. I never would have thought I would have developed into the product that I put out there this last weekend.
Mhm. So you have PR'd for, like, your idea of, like, what you wanted in a marathon, which was 3:30, right? Um, do you have another PR number in mind? Or you're I mean, I think it's really impressive as somebody who doesn't run, but even runners think it's impressive, but, um, is that something that you've been thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, it took me. I tell people that I didn't even really call myself a runner until I ran Boston, and Boston was my 5th or 6th marathon. So, like, I had trouble identifying as a runner until I ran the Boston Marathon. And Boston was my second time that I broke 4 hours. So I didn't break 4 hours until my 4th marathon, which was Chicago, if I recall correctly. And then I ran it again, sub 4, and I PR'd again in Boston. I think I ran like a 3:51 in Boston. And setting that goal of 3:30 was lofty at the time because that was going to be a big, big, big jump. I think I ran Berlin in like 3:47. So then all of a sudden I had to somehow break, 17 minutes or something like that to get to that PR. But that's where I really got to work, right? Like I hired a coach. I never hired a coach before. And, shout out to Joe because, um, he's held me accountable. And I am someone that needs that accountability, and needs that, you know, that second motion of discipline. Like I'm very disciplined as is foundationally, but to know that there's someone in my corner, who's holding me accountable, goes a long way. And so, nothing's off the table now, right? Like I'd love to beat my last PR in London. We ran a 3:28 in London, and it felt good. Like, and I didn't even like feel like I felt like I had a little bit more to give, which was awesome. But it's one of those things where as you continue to reach new levels, and understand what it is that you're capable of, um, you start to open up to the idea of, all right, what if I make this tweak or what if I make that tweak? Is it possible to shave off a minute here, shave off a minute there? Um, One of the things with me, and this is like, I'm happy, I'm grateful, I'm thankful, but I'm never satisfied. Like that's not that I'm never going to be satisfied because I'm always going to be looking for areas of improvement. Um, I'll be happy in the moment, and I'll take my moment and I'll celebrate my win. But I'm not going to be satisfied. So, to answer your question, my goal is to run better than I ran the last time.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I know you've talked about this probably on previous podcasts, but, you've stopped drinking for almost 2 years. Well, it'll be 2 years in December.
Yeah.
Um, what would you say you've learned through being sober? I mean,
Um.
not that you were an alcoholic, but,
Yeah.
being socially.
Yeah. Yeah, I've talked about it on the show, and I've talked about it on other podcasts as well. Um, it was a very matter of fact thing, right? Like there was no huge story behind it. It was like everybody else, just doing a dry January, finding out that I was running Boston in a couple of months. So I said, might as well stay dry and focus on the training, because that was only 2 or 3 months later. And, I figured whatever, I just won't drink and it'll probably help with my performance. And, as I've mentioned before on this show, it was right around the time that I interviewed Michael Chernow, and he talked about, his story and his journey, on the back of addiction and being sober for, several decades now. And the thing that resonated with me was, how he positioned it as wanting to be the highest performer in every element of his life. And it was right around the time that Elena was born. And, I thought to myself, I want to be the highest performing dad. I want to be the highest performing husband. I want to be the highest performing runner. I want to be the highest performing colleague, and contributor when it comes to my job. And so, if all I have to do is remove alcohol to be a higher performer, like, I've already removed it for the last 2, 3 months. Let me see how long I can keep this going. And so, in the back of my mind, I think, we've grown up in a culture that's conditioned us to believe we're not gonna be able to get by socially if we don't drink. We've been conditioned to believe, like, summers are gonna suck if you can't, drink while you're outside. Sports games are gonna suck if you can't have your beer. Holidays are gonna suck if you can't, drink with your family and friends. Weddings are gonna be lame if you can't, drink and get on the dance floor and let loose through alcohol. And so, I took a very scientific approach of just really testing the hypotheses and seeing, well, what happens if I don't drink? Am I going to be miserable? Am I going to be sad? Am I going to feel like I'm missing out on anything? Because, like you said, like, I wasn't an alcoholic. I always have the power to pick up a drink if I want to. But what I realized was it didn't really matter. Like, I was still happy. Um, in fact, I gained a lot of mental clarity. My recovery was infinitely better. My results from my workouts were also infinitely better, and I was a lot more present. You know, Maybe it wasn't as noticeable with you or with, my peers, but with Elena, I felt like I was a lot more present. There hasn't been a morning where I was like, "Hey babe, can you take care of Elena? I'm hungover." Right? Like, that hasn't happened, and I'm kind of grateful for that. Um, because, you know, she doesn't, or, I don't wanna miss a morning with her because of that. And so I wanna make sure that I approach this topic, like, really sensitively, because I don't wanna sound judgmental. I just wanna make sure that I enlighten the audience of my own learnings. Like, I don't care if people drink. I don't It doesn't really, and I don't judge anyone who does. But I have learned that there's a huge difference in my life from a clarity perspective, post making this decision.
Mhm. Did you feel any, like, social pressure to drink? I mean, a lot of your friends still drink.
To be honest, I did not feel too much pressure at first. Definitely some raised eyebrows, definitely some questions. But I do think the people that I cared to surround myself by, understood that making a decision like this was in line with how I'm wired, right? Like, I'm goal driven. I'm very focused on, um, seeing out my ambitions. And, the name of the book was Break Barriers. I like to break the mold. Like, I'm not necessarily conditioned to do things because everybody else does them. And so I don't think it was necessarily surprising to anyone. Um, and at the same time, and I'm sure you've experienced something similar, right? Like, as you're growing your family and you're kind of in this phase of life, um, you start to become a lot more intentional about who you're surrounding yourself with anyway. And so, if I was surrounded by anyone who had a strong, negative opinion about this kind of decision, chances are they weren't going to be in my life for much longer anyway. Because you just don't really have time to surround yourself with that kind of energy, while you're building a family.
Mhm. Well, and I know that your story had changed depending on like the season of not drinking. Like, so initially it was like, oh, I'm marathon training. Um, and then I actually don't remember what it was after that. But what do you tell people? Because you're not going to have enough time if you're out at a party and someone's like, oh, you want to drink, and you're like, no, I don't. Like, what do you say to them? That's like,
Well,
what's your answer?
now it's a lot more matter of fact. Now it's like, hey, like I haven't been drinking for like 2 years, so so
Do they
it
ask questions? Are people curious? Do they say like, why aren't you drinking?
Yeah, people ask every now and then, but I think now when you tell someone like I haven't had a drink in 2 years, the conversation gets a lot shorter. Yeah, they can make their own assumptions. They could assume like I must have had some sort of really traumatic alcohol background, and if they want to make that assumption, go ahead and make it, whatever. Or if they're naturally curious, they'll ask and I'll tell. But the majority of people that I'm now surrounded by also understand that I'm training year round. Like I'm taking, I'm taking my ambitions um when it comes to running really seriously, and it kind of makes sense. Anyone who takes these kind of goals really seriously, chances are isn't, out there
Hmm.
partying too much anyway.
Right. So you are now a two-time father to a 6-week old. Um, you're marathon training for New York, which is next month. You're still working full time. You didn't take paternity leave yet. Um, how are you managing everything?
That's a great question. It's definitely been a very blurry 5 or 6 weeks. The jump from 1 to 2 is really tough. A lot of people say that. I didn't necessarily know until it actually happened. I am grateful because this jump from 1 to 2 has allowed me to spend a lot more time with Elena. Given that you are um, spending more time with Emma, given just the fact that she's just a newborn right now. So that's been good. But I'm a big believer in the power of discipline. Like I think discipline is one of like the sexiest traits an individual can have. It's such an awesome, awesome trait because people don't realize how much they can get done if they just, employ discipline. And the truth is that like sometimes as humans we take time for granted, right? And the things that are important, um when you really narrow it down, it's your family, it's your mental health, your physical health, all of these things that are like it's your career. All these things, if you really break it down, can be done in a day. It's just more about being intentional about how you do it. And I was listening to a podcast the other day about someone talking about the power of discipline and how like he talks about how every day after dinner, no matter what, he's taking a 20-minute walk. And every day after dinner, no matter what, him and his partner have agreed on 10 minutes. They just step aside in a room and 5 minutes each, you know, they talk about, where they are in the day, if there's anything on their mind, and then they switch off because they have kids and, they can't really, but they're intentional about it every day. That 20-minute walk and that 10 minutes of, making sure you and your partner have some time together. So that way, like, you don't walk around with a burden and your partner doesn't know about it. And I think that, again, rooting discipline into uh, anything that you want to or anything that you prioritize is very, very important. Um, and I think that I had a solid baseline of discipline before parenthood, but parenthood kind of makes you it's make or break when it comes to employing discipline, right? Like if you don't employ discipline, good luck. Like, like because your kids, like, as you know, with Emma doesn't really care if you want to sleep. Emma doesn't care if you have things you have to do. And by the time Elena comes from school, she doesn't really care if you didn't finish your work or if you didn't get your workout in, right? So, these things that are important to you, you've got to be unapologetic, and you've got to make them non-negotiable. Um, and I think a big part of that is also, um, for the purpose of this episode, is making sure your partner knows what's actually important to you, right? Like, if your self-care is important to you, then you let me know. And if my, you know, training schedule is important to me, then I let you know. And then we have to cover each other, because those are the things that at the end of the day keep you going and keep me going.
Right. Are there any new areas that you've had to implement since having 2 children?
Since having 2 children, I've definitely had to squeeze in a lot more, uh, in the hours that Elena's in daycare, right? Because now I'm, on morning duty, with regards to getting her ready for school, with regard to making sure breakfast is ready, even though you did breakfast this morning, so thank you for that. Uh, making sure that breakfast is ready, making sure the dog is walked. All these things sound to the listeners probably sound like, oh, like, of course you got to do all these things. But, I know in my mind that the minute I come back from dropping her off at daycare until someone has to pick her up from daycare, that's my time. I got to make sure that I maximize that time. If I have, you know, I look at my schedule every day. I look to see where my blocks are between meetings, and wherever I find a block, that's more likely where I'm going to get my workout in. And I block it off. And again, I don't apologize about it. Like, from a career perspective, because the same way I show up for my family is the same way that I show up for work. And, I'm not going to stop, taking care of my mental health, um, just to prioritize anything else.
Mhm. Before becoming a father, did you have any fears about fatherhood?
No, I do like being a dad. So it's not I didn't have I don't think it's necessarily that I had any fears about fatherhood. I think I was definitely in the right stage of life. Like, I was ready for it. I think, um I I remember when I was younger, and this is common for a lot of immigrant families. A lot of times, like, your parents, and in particular my mom, would try to employ the behavior of, like, an older generation on me, right? And I had to be like, "Hey, mom, like, I'm 15, I wanna be 15. I wanna be irresponsible because I'm 15. I don't want to I don't wanna behave like I'm 25 when I'm 15, because then, that's gonna impact my social life at 15." And I was really, really intent on that. And it was something that kinda, like, stuck with me. So when I was 15, I behaved like a 15-year-old, and when I was 20 and 21, I behaved like a 21-year-old, and when I was 25, I behaved like a 25-year-old, and so on and so forth. And so I can look back, happy knowing that I was able to be present and able to live, those ages in a way that was in line with the way that they were meant to be lived. So that by the time I got to this stage of parenthood, I felt like, you know, I did what I had to do to navigate life, to learn what's important to me, to learn the areas that I needed to improve on, where I needed to do the work. And I had to do a lot of work. Like, I had to find myself, in a lot of those years. And the only way I was able to do that was by being present. And so that was the cool thing about when by the time we got to this phase where we decided we're gonna have kids, I wasn't like, "Oh, man, like, I wish I got to do this or I got to do that." Like, no, like, I already did everything that I wanted to do, and I was happy with how I had done it.
I guess I maybe phrased it incorrectly. When I said not fears about being a father, but like your fears for like how your children would turn up. But I will phrase it positively because I realize that that's a negative way of asking the question. Um, What are some things that you want Elena and Emma to learn from you as being their father?
I want them to know a couple of things. I want them to understand that you need to fall down in order to rise up, right? Like we all make mistakes. There's going to be failures. Like I'm not expecting perfection because I'm far from perfect. I think you would agree that you're far from perfect. I think that one of the beauties of just a loving household is loving somebody for being imperfectly perfect. And that's one of the things that I want to make sure that they feel and that they understand and that they know it's okay. And so there's that element of it. And then there's the outward element of, um, yes, it's important to, of course, have your ambition and to thrive for success. But it's also really important that you're lifting up and you're serving those around you, right? Like there's no happiness and success if it's success on your own, right? Like there's no it's really lonely, right? I know that there's a lot of people out there who've succeeded in their career, who've succeeded in their fields, who've made it to the top of their fields, and all they talk about is how lonely it is. Once you kind of get to a certain point in whatever respective field you're striving for, and so it's really important to be conscious on that track that as much as you're chasing down your goals and your ambitions, you're not losing sight and you're certainly not trampling on the people around you to get to where it is that you want to go. And I think that's really important. Especially, I think, I don't know what kind of world they're going to grow up in. It's going to be a lot different than the world you and I grew up in, just given how life has changed from when we grew up. But I feel like the landscape in many arenas is just very competitive. And so I want them to understand it's not always about winning as much as it is about getting better each day. And by getting better each day, it's not losing sight of the fact that um, there's a give and take here, and the give is just as important as the take.
Mhm. What do you mean by it's lonely?
Um, I meaning that um, there's a lot of people who had to isolate themselves in order to get to certain levels. Like, and I think there's a positive way to look at this, and then there's like another way to look at this, right? I know that a lot of people, like, they get to a point when they're figuring themselves out in, like, their 20s and 30s where they realize, like, "I haven't really been hanging out around the right people. I need to isolate myself in order to really get my priorities in line, and figure out who my tribe is, who I need to surround myself by, and how I'm gonna achieve the goals that I want to get to." And that, in a way, is lonely because you start to realize you've surrounded yourself with a lot of people who are really imposters or who are people that aren't really, caring about what your priorities are, what your ambitions are. And that's fine and that's normal and that's healthy. I went through that. There was definitely a period in my life where I had to kind of take a step back and be like, you guys are great, but like we're going in different directions and I need to focus on me. So there's that element of it that's lonely. And then there's another element of it where um you're chasing down a certain goal, and there's a lot of people out there who perhaps don't understand how or why, or can't connect with, or they're projecting, their own insecurities on you to get to that position. And that is another form of isolation, right? And you can react to that in two ways, right? You can react to that by, you know, telling them to F off and, essentially projecting a holier than thou kind of attitude on them. Or you can continue to work in silence, and do your best to bring up the other people around you who see what you're doing, and who can gain from it, right? And I think that's really, really important is um, making sure that um, you lead with humility when you go about doing these things, um, because that humility it attracts light, and light attracts light, and that's really what you want to do.
Yeah. No, I would agree. What would you say is your biggest joy about being a father?
Oh man, too many here. I was talking to you about this yesterday. I mean, this is just a little, and this isn't necessarily answering the question about the biggest joy, but Elena's in this phase now where her her favorite phrase is quote unquote no help. She doesn't want help doing anything. She doesn't want help going up the stairs. She doesn't want help getting in the car. She doesn't want to help eating. She doesn't want help with anything. And so when we go to school in the morning, she insists on getting herself in the car and getting herself in her car seat. And she's only 2. Like she's not she can walk, she can get around, but she doesn't move that quick. And so, I just want to lift her up and put her in the car seat and put her seatbelt on. And that'll be like, a 3-minute process, where not even a 3-minute process, a 2-minute process, where she insists on, lifting herself up into the car, crawling on the floor, lifting herself up into the seat, twirling until she gets into the seat. All of a sudden, what could be done in 2 minutes is done in 10 minutes. And, as a parent, you can't say anything. You can't get frustrated. You can't get mad at them. You can't yell at them as much as you're in a rush and you have to get places. You just need to take a step back and let them learn and watch them learn. And that's been an awesome joy as a parent for me to be able to not only watch her learn, but to also see myself grow in a way. Like I've always talked about patience as being as an important tenor, but this is a different kind of patience. This is let your human evolve kind of patience, which is much, much, much different. And you don't think about it, but the truth is employing that patience has a profound effect on her because it's allowing her to learn what she's capable of, right? Historically speaking, anytime I've talked about patience, I've talked about it in the sense of breaking down your barriers, right? And overcoming obstacles and understanding that you don't always get the results you want when you want them from a personal perspective. But this kind of patience, while it does impact you profoundly, it has an even deeper impact on her because you're allowing her to do something that for her, like being able to get herself up into that car seat, that's quite an accomplishment for her. That's like her equivalent of, my 6 star. So like, you know,
Right.
that for me has been really, really awesome. And so I'd point to something like that because things like that now are like happening every day where like I'm coming across like new learnings as a dad.
Do you have any other ones that you would say?
I think that one of the things that I've learned, and we've talked about this too, because it's not easy. Like parenthood is not easy. It's great. It's rewarding. Definitely more pros than cons. Would not trade it in. But what you realize as you're going through this journey is there's nothing more important about going down this journey than having the right partner. And so kudos to you, because you're definitely the right partner for me. But that was a really, immediate, recognition of this entire process is the most important thing about becoming a parent is becoming a parent with the right person. Because just like anything else, it all comes down to communication and how you communicate, and especially how you communicate and handle, moments of uncertainty. The truth is, and people have heard this a million times. There is no instruction manual, right? When it comes to parenting, no one really knows what they're doing. There's a lot of curveballs thrown your way, and unless you're with the right person to navigate those kind of scenarios, it can become more and more difficult. So, I think becoming a father has helped ground my confidence in the power of our relationship.
Right. So as a psychologist, I see a lot of, I mean, I see a lot of clients. A lot of people, are divorced or in the dating field and they are having a hard time finding a partner. And sometimes they divorce and they're on good terms, sometimes they're not on good terms. Sometimes people will say, you know, he was a good partner, but not a good father, or he's a really good father, but not a good partner. Um, are there any qualities, I mean, and this is just from you know, your experience that you would say is important to look for in a partner that also translates into like a good partner?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think you got to be real with yourself, right? Because when you when you're a parent, you come across certain things that you need to decide with your partner that you're not going to talk about, while dating. Like when you're dating someone, chances are you're not going to have the conversation around like, when would it be appropriate to take your start weaning your child off a pacifier? When do you think it would be appropriate to start potty training your child? When do you think it would be, or what kind of school do you want to send your child to, right? Like you generally speak to them, at a higher level, like, do you want to have children one day? Do you want to raise your children, this way or that way? What do you believe about this or what do you believe about that? But the important thing when it comes to parenting and relationships in general is just the ability to compromise. And so I think it's really important that early on in a relationship, you start to pick up on how well are the two of you compromising? How often are you just appeasing versus how often are you, compromising and meeting in the middle? And compromising is a journey in and of itself, right? Like when you're first getting to know someone, sometimes it is like a trade-off. It's like today we'll do this and tomorrow we'll do that because this makes you happy and this makes me happy, right? And that's fine at the very onset, right? Like it again, you're working with each other and in a way that is compromise. But as your relationship evolves and you get more and more intertwined, as you generally do, in a marriage and ultimately as parents, you really have to, be able to come and meet each other in the middle. And it's no longer about like, we're going to do this for you today and that for me tomorrow. Sometimes the sacrifices get bigger. And sometimes the listening has to get stronger. Whereas, earlier on, you can let a lot more slide. So if you're dating or like if you're in the earlier stages of a relationship, take note, like, how well does this person compromise? How well do they listen? A lot of times, you could be saying something, but they're hearing something else. And so the question is, how well are you expressing yourself? And do you need to adapt your self-expression style? And so those are things to consider.
Hmm. So my last and final question, um, is you've had a few mile 40 moments in your life, like there was childhood leukemia, um, there was like, another emergence in your teenage years. There was the actual mile 40 moment uh during your triathlon, mini triathlon.
Yeah,
What was it
half
called?
Ironman.
Half Ironman. Clearly I don't do those things. But have you had any recent mile 40 moments like in the last couple of years or
Um, that's a really good question. Um,
did I just steal your podcast?
no, you didn't. Okay, I'll be vulnerable, and it is a good way to end out this episode. Um, Writing Audacious for me was in a way, uh, mile 40-esque, um, because it was exiting my comfort zone in a way where Break Barriers was talking about me, right? Like I knew that story better than anyone else. So no one can really question, what I was writing in terms of the content for Break Barriers. That was all me. Whereas Audacious was more of like a thought leadership piece. And it was like, hey, like, have I earned the right to share my thought leadership on how to accomplish goals? Right. Like, like it was kind of like taking a leap of sorts with regards to the unknown. Right. Like, yeah, you would think he's written one book, he can write a second book. And for me, that was tough. It was challenging. And then when it was published, it was an even bigger challenge because I dealt with a little bit of an imposter syndrome around it when it came out. And I had not the greatest experience with regards to how it was distributed. And I worked with a publicist that I had a negative experience with at the time. Um, and I remember speaking to my editor like 6 months after the fact, and he's like, "Hey, like I haven't really seen you, talking about it too much." And I told him, and I was like, "Look, I kind of deflated myself on the back of writing Audacious because I dealt with a lot of insecurity around putting together a thought leader piece." Um, and so I had to work through that, and I did, and ever since the book's done better than I thought it would do in a great way. But like I did with the original Mile 40 moment, I've learned over and over again that you need to put yourself in these uncomfortable situations in order to understand what you're capable of, and to understand that you have the ability to navigate, scenarios that perhaps you could have never envisioned. And I know for a lot of people, like that's not really relatable. Like, why is he talking about writing his second book and how difficult that was? But for me, it was difficult. Um, you know, owning owning that role as a thought leader and positioning it, and it was definitely a learning experience for me that I think has positioned me well for where I see the broader platform going.
Mhm. All right. Well, those are all the questions I had for you.
Well, thank you for putting me on the hot seat today. I really enjoyed, this episode. The listeners, I really hope you enjoyed this format for episode 100. I'm, like I said in the very beginning, I'm incredibly grateful for all of you for continuing to tune in, for supporting the show. Um, I've got lots of ideas for where I want to take it. For right now, though, I just want to celebrate this milestone. And I just want to say thank you. And be sure to slap that subscribe button. And I'll see you on the other side. Thank you.